Kim Yen, now 23, had lived through more heartache than most her age. Married just 7 days ago to Kim Taehyung, a 29-year-old man she had barely exchanged words with, her life felt like a blur. Taehyung, a successful software developer living in New York, was known for his maturity and responsibility. Despite being the eldest son, his relationship with his family in Busan, his mother, Mrs. Kim, younger sister Jiha, and younger brother Suho, had always been strained. Yen, on the other hand, came from a broken home. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and her father remarried quickly after, always resenting Yen for not being the son he had desired. Her younger brothers were spoiled, leaving Yen to grow up as little more than a maid in her own home. On her wedding day, Yen had been told by her father and stepmother that there was no turning back, that she was to be an obedient daughter-in-law. She had complied, accepting her fate. But in the 7 days since her wedding, Taehyung had barely spoken to her. They hadn't even consummated their marriage. It felt more like she was living with a stranger than a husband. Taehyung had left the night before, returning to New York for work after his short leave ended. She hadn't thought much of it, until the next morning. As Yen went about her morning routine, making the bed, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to see Suho standing awkwardly in the doorway, his expression strained. "Suho, good morning, sister-in-law." "Yen, good morning," she replied, frowning at his sudden appearance. "I was just coming down." Suho. Actually. Mom couldn't face you, so she sent me." Yen's confusion deepened. Why couldn't Mrs. Kim face her? Suho held out a piece of paper, and Yen hesitantly took it, her heart already starting to race. As her eyes scanned the letter, her world crumbled. The letter read, "Dear Yen, I am sorry to tell you like this, but I couldn't say it to your face. I married you only for my mother, nothing else. I have someone else in my life, waiting for me in New York. Over these past few days, I realized I made a mistake by marrying you. I've ruined 3 lives, and to correct this, I've made my decision. I hope you find someone who will love and cherish you, but I'm sorry, I cannot be that person. Wishing you all the best. Taehyung." Yen's hands trembled as she read the words over and over again, trying to process what they meant. How could this be happening? The ground felt like it was slipping beneath her feet, and her vision blurred with tears. "Suho, here," he said quietly, handing her another paper. It was a set of divorce papers, already signed by Taehyung. Her breath hitched as she realized what this meant. Taehyung was gone, for good. Yen slowly retreated back into the room, closing the door behind her as Suho stood awkwardly in the hallway. The moment she was alone, she broke down completely, pressing her hand to her mouth as sobs racked her body. The life she had just begun, the marriage she had hoped would at least bring some stability, had been shattered before it even had a chance to start. Her heart, already bruised from years of neglect, now felt irreparably broken. Yen stood outside her parents' house, her body trembling, still reeling from the shock of what had happened. She had been married for only 7 days, and now, she was divorced without a single explanation. Taehyung had left her with nothing but a letter and signed divorce papers. She wanted to confront him, ask him why, but she didn't even have his phone number. She had never realized how disconnected they truly were until now. As her heart ached, Yen wiped her tears and numbly signed the divorce papers. She packed her belongings quietly, her tears falling onto her clothes as she cursed her fate. She wanted to disappear without anyone noticing, without hearing any pity or sympathy from those who would only pretend to care. Once packed, Yen left the house in silence, slipping out like a ghost. She didn't want to confront anyone or hear their empty words. She hailed a cab, and when it pulled up to her parents' home, she stepped out, paying the driver with trembling hands. She walked up to the door, her heart heavy, and rang the bell. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing her stepmother's disapproving face. "Stepmom, you. What are you?" she gasped, her eyes dropping to the suitcase Yen held in her hands. "What is this?" as she pointed, her tone accusatory. "Yen, he divorced me." Yen whispered, her voice breaking. She hoped, deep down, that her stepmother would offer some kindness. But it didn't come. Her stepmother scoffed, her face twisting in disdain. Stepmom, you must have done something, huh? She sneered. Tears welled up in Yen's eyes as she shook her head, unable to find the words to defend herself. Yen, before she could say anything further, her father's voice cut through the tense silence. Dad, who is it? Stepmom, your daughter. Her father appeared, his face hard and emotionless. Yen's heart sank even further when she saw him. Yen, Dad, she cried, desperation in her voice. Dad, why are you here? He asked coldly. Before Yen could respond, her stepmother's voice interrupted once again. Stepmom, he divorced her. Her father scoffed, the sound cutting into Yen like a knife. Dad, then why are you here? He repeated, his tone harsh. Yen, Dad, where will I go? She pleaded, her voice trembling. Her father crossed his arms, unmoved by her despair. Dad, I don't know. It's not our problem anymore. There's no space for a burden like you here. Finally got rid of you, and now look at you. His words were cruel, each one like a dagger. Her stepmother stepped closer, her lips curled into a sneer. Stepmom, shameless. Coming back here like this. Go away. She began to close the door, but Yen quickly stopped it, pushing it open just enough to get her foot inside. Yen, no, Mom. Don't do this. I have nowhere to go, she begged, tears streaming down her face. Her stepmother rolled her eyes in disgust. Stepmom, it's not our headache. Go away. She pushed against the door, trying to shut Yen out. Yen pressed her body against the door, desperation fueling her. Yen, no, Mom, please. Please, Dad, she cried, her voice cracking with sorrow. Suddenly, her father stepped forward and shoved her hard. Yen lost her balance and fell backward onto the cold, hard ground. She gasped in pain, tears blurring her vision. The door slammed shut in her face, and she could hear the lock turning on the other side. Yen, please, she screamed, banging her fists against the door. Please. Open the door. But no one came. No one answered her cries. She continued pounding on the door, her voice growing hoarse, her tears falling freely. Yen took her suitcase and walked away, her heart heavy with the weight of her shattered life. She wandered aimlessly through the streets, her steps slow and uncertain. Each passing moment felt longer than the last as the city lights flickered around her. Eventually, she found herself on the side of a busy road, sitting on the footpath. The night had fallen, and the cold air began to bite. Yen opened her worn-out purse, pulling out a crumpled $20 note and a few scattered coins. She stared at them in disbelief. How had her life come to this? No money, no family, no friends. She was utterly helpless. Her eyes lifted, watching the blur of cars zooming past her. She wondered if any of those people had the life she could only dream of. A life filled with love, security, warmth, everything that felt so far away from her reality. She wished, just for a moment, that she had a phone, something to reach out to someone, anyone. But even if she had one, who would she call? Who would care? Her heart clenched, the realization sinking in deeper than before. She was truly alone. The city sounds filled the air, the distant honking of cars, the muffled conversations of pedestrians walking by, oblivious to the girl sitting on the sidewalk, lost in her own world of pain. Her life, filled with nothing but cruelty, lay in ruins at her feet. It was dark now, the world around her swallowed by shadows. It's late, you should go home, a voice startled her from her thoughts. Yen blinked, her gaze lifting to meet the wrinkled face of an old woman standing a few feet away. The woman's clothes were torn and shabby, and she had the kind of face that had seen too much, yet her voice held a soft gentleness. Yen, huh? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, confused by the woman's words. Old woman, it's late, you should go home. Yen's heart sank even further. Home. She let out a bitter chuckle that sounded more like a broken cry. Yen, home, she echoed, feeling the tears well up in her eyes again. But I have none. The old woman watched her for a moment, her eyes scanning Yen's face as if trying to read her soul. Old woman, do you have anywhere to go? She asked quietly. Yen shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. The tears that she had been trying to hold back started to spill down her cheeks, her chest heaving with silent sobs. The old woman nodded as if she understood the story Yen couldn't say aloud. Old woman, then come with me, she said firmly. Yen, huh? Yen glanced at her, taken aback by the sudden offer. Her gaze shifted to the old woman's appearance, torn, threadbare clothes, shoes that looked as if they could fall apart any moment. Is she a beggar? Old woman, no buts, the old woman interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Come with me. It's not safe for you to sit here. Yen hesitated for a moment, but something in the woman's voice, a quiet yet commanding warmth, made her stand up. Grabbing her suitcase, she followed the old woman down the street. They walked in silence, crossing through narrow alleys that grew darker with each step. The cold was more biting here, and the shadows seemed longer. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a small, dilapidated house tucked away from the bustling streets. The roof sagged, and the walls were cracked, with peeling paint barely clinging to the surface. Yen stood still for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the broken windows and the worn-out door, but the old woman led her inside. Old woman, come on, it's not much, but it's better than the streets. Inside, it was just as shabby as the outside, if not more. The furniture was old and mismatched, with a few broken chairs and a table that looked ready to collapse at any moment. The dim light flickered from a bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. The old woman motioned for Yen to sit on one of the chairs, and Yen gingerly lowered herself onto it, half expecting it to break under her weight. Sitting there, Yen looked around, taking in the sight of the place. The cracks in the walls, the faint smell of dampness, the sheer emptiness of it all. She couldn't help but wonder how this woman managed to live here. The old woman noticed her gaze and smiled, a smile that seemed out of place in such a broken-down house. Old woman, this is how a beggar's house looks like, she said with a soft laugh. Yen's eyes widened, her heart skipping a beat at the woman's words. Yen, you are, she started, her voice trailing off in shock. The old woman nodded, still smiling, as if her reality didn't bother her in the slightest. Yen's heart sank as she stared at the worn-out figure before her, realizing that the old woman who had offered her shelter was indeed a beggar. The thought shook her. Here she was, having lost everything, her family, her husband, her dignity, and now, the only person willing to help her was someone who had nothing themselves. Old woman, yes, I am a beggar, the old woman said, still smiling despite the harsh reality of her words. But even beggars have kindness to give, child. Yen sat quietly, her hands trembling on the handle of her suitcase. The small, broken-down house was barely holding together, the walls cracked, the furniture sparse and crumbling. The air inside felt stale, but it was shelter, and in that moment, Yen felt the warmth of being somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't the cold, harsh streets. Yen, I don't know what to say. Yen whispered, her voice thick with tears. She had never imagined herself in such a situation. The old woman chuckled softly, her laugh crackling like dry leaves in the wind. Old woman, you don't have to say anything. Sometimes life gives us nothing but pain, but it's up to us to find meaning in that. Now, you must be hungry. Yen blinked, surprised by the kindness in the old woman's voice. She felt a pang of guilt, this woman had nothing, and yet she was offering what little she had. Yen, I can't take anything from you. I don't deserve this, Yen said, her voice shaking. The old woman waved her hand dismissively. Old woman, nonsense. Deserving has nothing to do with kindness. It's late, and you're alone. We help each other, even if it's only in small ways. Yen nodded, tears still clinging to her eyelashes. She had never experienced such selfless kindness in her life, especially not from her own family. Her heart ached as she thought about everything she had lost, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of warmth, something that resembled hope. The old woman shuffled to a corner of the room and pulled out a small pot from under a makeshift shelf. She placed it over a tiny fire stove and began heating up some broth, the scent of it filling the small space. As YN sat there, waiting, she couldn't help but feel a sense of surreal disbelief. In just a matter of hours, her entire world had collapsed, and now she was sitting in a beggar's home, being offered a meal from someone who had next to nothing. YN, thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The old woman smiled gently as she poured the broth into a cracked bowl and handed it to YN. Old woman, eat, child. You'll need your strength for tomorrow. YN took the bowl, the warmth of it spreading through her hands, and she sipped the broth slowly. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had expected to find that night. She looked up at the old woman, her heart full of gratitude. As she ate, YN realized that for the first time in days, she wasn't crying. The pain was still there, deep in her chest, but it felt lighter now, like she wasn't carrying it all on her own. YN, why are you helping me? YN asked quietly, her voice filled with both curiosity and wonder. The old woman paused for a moment, her eyes softening. Old woman, because I know what it feels like to have nothing, and no one. And sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change someone's fate. YN stared at her, the weight of those words sinking into her soul. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to rebuild, to start over. And if a beggar could find the strength to offer kindness despite everything, maybe she could find the strength to survive too.